As always, 2023 was an interesting year for the major Hollywood studios. There were the usual hits and flops affected by a variety of things. We started to see the release of movies whose budgets ballooned thanks to the effects of the pandemic, and there were lengthy actors and writers' strikes which only lasted as long as they did because of the studios. Market share-wise, Universal and Disney were neck and neck, and whichever one wins depends on how you look at the figures. If you include that indie film divisions, Focus Features, and Searchlight Pictures, then Universal wins. If, like me, you don't count them, then Disney had the highest market share. The numbers were so close, though, it does not really matter who comes out on top. So ignoring the market share ranking, if you were to ask me whether Universal or Disney had the better year, then Universal definitely wins. Universal's biggest triumph in 2023 was with the Super Mario Bros. Movie, which showed the incredible popularity of the video games. It also became the highest-grossing film produced by Illumination, and even though, as of this recording, a sequel surprisingly has not been announced yet, I'm sure it will not be the last time we see those plumbers on the big screen. Another incredible box office performance came with Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. While some might argue its success was because of the movie that opened the same day, I think its popularity extended well beyond the Barbenheimer meme. Nolan has proven himself to be one of the few directors nowadays whose name is enough to attract audiences. To see a dialogue-heavy, 3-hour historical drama perform like a genuine blockbuster is quite remarkable, especially since many assumed the audience for these sorts of movies disappeared during the pandemic. Blumhouse continued to be a hitmaker for Universal. Much like Illumination with Mario, they also scored their highest-grossing film with a video game adaptation. Five Nights at Freddy's attracted fans of the games as well as the usual horror audience and added a new film franchise to Universal's slate. Megan was another successful horror film, partly thanks to its intriguing premise and partly due to an attention-grabbing viral dance trend. When it got terrible reviews and an indifferent audience reaction, I expected The Exorcist Believer to drop like a rock after its opening weekend, but it actually held on quite well. While Universal and Blumhouse probably had higher expectations considering how much they paid for the rights, and it's even Blumhouse's most expensive film, it did reasonably enough. Fast 10 has fallen into the category of movies in 2023 whose box office performance would ordinarily be seen as a success, but its budget became inflated by pandemic-related production issues in addition to suddenly having to find a new director. It stayed about even with the 9th Fast and Furious movie worldwide, but it'll be interesting to see how the next film does. The comedy Cocaine Bear did fine relative to its budget, and while M. Night Shyamalan's Knock at the Cabin did not post too impressive numbers, it thankfully did not cost much. Trolls Band Together has done okay, albeit unspectacularly, although ancillary revenue and merchandise might help it turn a profit. I'm not sure there will be a 4th Trolls movie, though. Migration is still early in its box office run, and has 2 months in the new year without any new family films opening, so I do think by the end, the film will wind up another success for Illumination, even though it won't come close to Mario and Minion numbers. Despite Universal's overall solid year, the studio did have its share of low-grossing titles. Ruby Gillman Teenage Kraken was probably the biggest underperformer for them, largely hampered by being released in a competitive time. Parents are a lot more cautious these days on which family movies to spend money taking their children to, and Ruby Gillman lost out. Strays was another flop, with not many biting into its premise of foul-mouthed dogs. Finally, Universal experienced not one, but 2 box office flops about Dracula, as neither Renfield nor The Last Voyage of the Demeter caught on. I mentioned Disney was close in market share to Universal, but I don't think 2023 will be a year the Mouse House will look back fondly on. Easily the biggest success for Disney was Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, which was an example of how fond the audience is of that ragtag group of space heroes. One of the most fascinating box office runs of the year came with Elemental. The film opened very low for a Pixar film, and many immediately wrote it off after that weekend. But then something remarkable happened, and it experienced incredible word of mouth and chugged along during the summer. Elemental posted a strong multiple in North America and especially resonated with international audiences, and got to almost $500 million worldwide. A movie does not go from a low opening weekend to experiencing fantastic staying power without resonating with audiences in some way, and Disney even put out a press release saying how proud they were of its box office run. The live-action remake of The Little Mermaid is an interesting case. This was one of those movies that saw its budget grow out of control because of pandemic production delays, so it had its challenges ahead of it in order to turn a profit. Interesting enough, even though the culture war nonsense tends to be at its loudest in North America, Little Mermaid performed extremely well in that market. It was overseas that the film did not seem to resonate as much. So in the end, while merchandising and other additional revenue will help it eventually turn a profit, this was not exactly a resounding success. Then you have Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, which did about the same as the previous Ant-Man in North America, but like Little Mermaid, it did not make much of an impact internationally. It was also one of those films that opened strong and then dropped dramatically in the weeks afterwards, and I would argue the reception towards Quantumania did damage the Marvel brand. A Haunting in Venice made a little less than Death on the Nile, although its budget was lower. We'll have to wait and see if Disney decides to bankroll more of these Agatha Christie mysteries. The horror movie The Boogeyman performed okay, helped that it was originally intended for Hulu and cost a lot less than several other theatrical releases in 2023. And that brings us to the mega flops, and they were quite plentiful. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny pulled in hugely disappointing numbers for this storied franchise, and it did not help the movie's fortunes that production delays and the pandemic caused it to have a $300 million budget. Although even if the budget was more reasonable, I don't think making half the gross of Kingdom of the Crystal Skull was what Disney had in mind when they greenlit Indy's fifth and likely final big-screen adventure. The second attempt to make a Haunted Mansion movie did not bring too many people out to see those 999 goes. In fact, despite costing $60 million more and having 20 years of ticket price inflation on its side, this new movie somehow made even less than The Haunted Mansion with Eddie Murphy. Even though it's Disney's celebratory 100th anniversary animated movie, which appears to have been largely dismissed by audiences who were not interested in Disney's fairytale magic and musical numbers this time around. The creator was widely praised for having an economical budget for a special effects heavy science fiction movie, and I can see Hollywood studios looking at it to see how that can be replicated. However, the film still underperformed and did not make that money back. And finally, there's The Marvels. There's no way to sugarcoat this. This was a disaster and the low point for Marvel Studios, as it became the first film to make less than $100 million at the domestic box office. And the international audience did not come to the rescue either. It was bound to happen to a Marvel movie at some point, but I did not expect it to happen so soon. I'm sure there's a lot of evaluating going on at Marvel about how to reverse their fortunes, as well as Disney as a whole. Disney does have a history of bouncing back after a disappointing box office run, so I think they will eventually return to their former glory. It's just a matter of when and how. Warner Brothers had a bit of a lopsided year, at least for the movies that were not turned into tax write-offs. Barbie was the star of their slate, becoming a legit cultural phenomenon and the highest-grossing movie of the year. It has certainly made Greta Gerwig one of the most in-demand filmmakers in Hollywood, and likely with the ability to pick any project she wants. And of course, it will result in several studios asking, what toy can we turn into a movie next? Wonka was the top choice of the holiday season, with audiences charmed by this latest version of Roald Dahl's famous chocolatier, and I'm sure behind closed doors there are already sequels being discussed. The horror movies The Nun 2 and Evil Dead Rise did well, an example of how loyal the audience for scary flicks are, and why it's probably the most profitable genre. Looking up The Meg 2, I was surprised it got to almost $400 million worldwide. A slight drop from the first movie, and it probably only just broke even, but nonetheless showed people were still interested in seeing that giant shark go to lunch. I also have to mention the animated film Mummies. This was a low-budget Spanish film Warner bankrolled, and it managed to get to over $50 million. Even in North America, where it only played in limited release and did not have much of a marketing push, it made $4 million. Studio did have a considerable number of underperformers. House Party and Magic Mike's Last Dance were originally intended for HBO Max, but were given theatrical releases instead. But with how they did, maybe streaming was the better option. The Color Purple is a movie I'm scratching my head over. It got solid reviews, had a great opening day on Christmas, and audience reception seemed positive. However, it's not been experiencing much staying power since then, and I don't understand why. It's very strange. The low points for Warner Brothers were definitely with their 4 DC movies. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom has done the least bad out of all of them, but still not generating the numbers any studio wants from a big-budget superhero movie. Shazam! Fear of the Gods and Blue Beetle were also major disappointments on their release. And then you have The Flash, the movie that executives proudly proclaimed was one of the best superhero movies of all time, and they even roped in Tom Cruise and Stephen King to sing its praises. Audiences disagree with that though, and it turned out to be a colossal and embarrassing flop. People in general just seem to have moved on from the DC Extended Universe, so good luck James Gunn. Hopefully your DC universe begins more strongly than this one ended. In 2023, Sony Pictures went back to how Hollywood studios used to do things, with a few big releases and then thrown the dice at a bunch of smaller movies. Their biggest blockbuster was Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, which saw a big increase in attendance from the first movie and was one of the few superhero movies last year to excite audiences with its multiversal mayhem and eye-popping visuals. Meanwhile, The Equalizer 3 continued to show how remarkably consistent this franchise is. Seriously, every single Equalizer movie has made around $190 million, really living up to the title of the series. Another movie series that's retained its audience is Insidious, with the 5th movie, The Red Door, becoming the highest grossing in the franchise. The Tom Hanks movie, A Man Called Otto, was a nice little sleeper earlier in the year, and the horror movie Thanksgiving did well enough on its low budget to already announce a sequel in the works. 2 other films with minimal budgets, Missing and The Pope's Exorcist, also performed solidly. The romantic comedy Anyone But You has been experiencing great word of mouth since opening just before Christmas. Its success seems to be a return to the date movie and how rom-coms used to perform. It's nice to see Sony release movies like this that have been largely written off by Hollywood, but proving there's still an audience for them. I'm looking forward to seeing where Anyone But You ends up at the end of its run. Ridley Scott's historical epic Napoleon has done okay for a movie of its type, although it's worth pointing out Apple was the principal financier for this movie, with Sony just handling the distribution. Sony does seem pleased with how Napoleon's performed, because they recently signed a deal to release more Apple movies in theaters. No Hard Feelings did not make its money back on theatrical release, but it was a noble attempt to bring back the star-driven R-rated comedy. The racing movie Gran Turismo tried to capitalize off the success of the video game, but it only went so far. Sony's slate also had a number of low-performing films that were largely ignored. The science fiction movie 65, starring Adam Driver, was a notable flop. They tried to get in on the GameStop short squeeze trend with dumb money, but few people bought tickets. The comedy The Machine, sports biopic Big George Foreman, religious movie Journey to Bethlehem, and romantic comedy Love Again got even less interest and largely came and went from theaters. This brings us to the last major studio, Paramount. Even though they were last in market share for 2023, it was not for lack of trying. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 saw its budget go to massive heights due to pandemic-related production difficulties. Had it cost about the same as other movies in the franchise, it would be seen as a success. It mostly had to contend with its legs getting cut short by releasing a week before Barbie and Oppenheimer stormed in and grabbed several people's attention. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem did quite well, although its gross is skewed more domestic. Nonetheless, Paramount seems pleased with it, and a sequel is reportedly being developed. Scream 6 was another successful entry in that popular horror series, and I'm sure we would be getting another sequel very soon had certain behind-the-scenes difficulties not arisen. Paw Patrol the Mighty Movie was another example of the series' popularity with young children, and it's little surprise there'll be a third movie. Killers of the Flower Moon was entirely funded by Apple, with Paramount merely acting as a theatrical distributor, so that's something to keep in mind when looking at its $200 million budget. For an almost 3.5 hour historical drama about a tough subject matter, it did about as well as it could have, even with Leonardo DiCaprio in the lead. Among the major disappointments, Transformers Rise of the Beast continued to show the downward trend of that franchise, so we'll see where it goes from here, although there is already an animated Transformers movie deep into production right now. Despite a positive audience and critical reception, Dungeons & Dragons On Among Thieves did not come close to making its money back. Maybe a release date in a less competitive spot could have helped it, but it does seem like the kind of movie people find later on streaming and then become disappointed a sequel is not happening. Lastly, the comedy 80 for Brady had underwhelming numbers. So that was how the major studios fared in 2023. Of course, the strikes have already affected their release schedule for 2024, and we'll probably see many more shifts in the calendar. Nonetheless, I anticipate another year of expected hits, surprise successes, and disappointing flops as Hollywood continues to adjust to audience tastes. See you next time.